June 4, 1942. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean with the kind of indifference that only nature possesses when men prepare to slaughter one another. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his eyes scanning the horizon where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers cut through the waves like sharks hunting prey. The combined fleet had never tasted defeat, and this morning promised to deliver another crushing blow to the Americans who had dared to resist the inevitable tide of Japanese expansion. 6 months had passed since the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Empire's military machine had rolled across Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, once deemed an impregnable fortress, had surrendered in humiliating fashion. The Dutch East Indies now belonged to Tokyo. Burma was collapsing. The rising sun flag flew over territories spanning from the frozen wastes of the Aleutians to the steaming jungles bordering India. In Tokyo, military planners spoke openly of dictating peace terms from the White House lawn. Yet Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's greatest victories, harbored doubts that he shared with no one. He had studied at Harvard University, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively across the United States. Unlike his colleagues who dismissed America as a nation of soft, decadent materialists, Yamamoto understood the sleeping giant's industrial capacity. He had famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he held no confidence in ultimate victory. That 6-month window was now closing. The plan for Midway Island represented everything audacious and everything flawed about Japanese naval strategy. The tiny atoll, sitting northwest of Hawaii, held minimal strategic value beyond its airstrip. But Yamamoto believed that threatening Midway would force the American Pacific Fleet, particularly its precious aircraft carriers, into a decisive battle. The Japanese would then annihilate the American carriers, secure dominance over the Central Pacific, and perhaps force the United States to negotiate a settlement that recognized Japan's new empire. According to historical analyses documented in numerous military journals, including the Naval War College Review, Japanese intelligence had failed catastrophically in the weeks preceding the battle. Tokyo believed the American carrier Yorktown had been sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. They assumed the remaining American carriers were still near the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles away. Japanese radio intercepts had been compromised, but overconfidence prevented proper security measures. The result was a stunning reversal. Japan was sailing into an ambush while believing it was setting one. The 4 carriers at the heart of Japan's striking force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the concentrated power of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm. These floating fortresses had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the most experienced naval aviators in the world, veterans of campaigns in China and across the Pacific. Each carrier bore the weight of Japan's destiny upon its wooden deck. As dawn broke on that fateful June morning, mechanics swarmed over dozens of aircraft, preparing them for the initial strike against Midway's defenses. Below decks, pilots ate their breakfast and joked about the easy victory ahead. Nobody suspected that 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the supposedly destroyed Yorktown, were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting with lethal patience for the perfect moment to strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz had accomplished something extraordinary in the weeks before June 4, 1942. From his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet had orchestrated an intelligence coup that would determine the war's trajectory. Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Through painstaking analysis of encrypted messages, Rochefort's team determined that Japan was planning a massive operation against a target identified only as AF. The intelligence officers needed confirmation of what AF meant. Rochefort suspected it was Midway, but suspicion wouldn't convince the skeptics in Washington. So the codebreakers devised an ingenious trap. They had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that the island's water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation was absolute. Midway was the target. Armed with this foreknowledge, Nimitz made decisions that violated every conventional military doctrine. He committed his outnumbered carriers to a position where they could ambush the Japanese fleet, despite having only 3 carriers against Japan's 4, and despite possessing fewer aircraft flown by less experienced pilots. The Enterprise and Hornet had steamed out of Pearl Harbor on May 28th. The Yorktown, heavily damaged at Coral Sea and requiring months of repairs, was patched up in an incredible 72 hours and sent to sea on May 30th, with work crews still aboard. The American carriers arrived at a position called Point Luck, northeast of Midway, on June 2nd. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, the senior officer, led the task force from Yorktown. The Americans maintained strict radio silence and waited with their radar sweeping the skies, knowing the Japanese were coming but not knowing exactly when they would arrive. Midway Island itself prepared for the onslaught. The tiny atoll, barely 6 miles across, had been reinforced with marine fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Army Air Force B-17 flying fortresses had been stationed there. Anti-aircraft guns bristled from every defensive position. The Marines and sailors manning these defenses understood they would face the opening blow of the Japanese attack. They were the bait that would draw the enemy carriers into range. The American plan depended on precise timing and extraordinary courage. When the Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway, their aircraft would be absent for approximately 2 hours. During that window, the carriers would be vulnerable as they recovered their aircraft and prepared them for a second strike. That was when Spruance and Fletcher intended to launch everything they had. The American pilots who would execute this plan represented a stark contrast to their Japanese counterparts. Many were fresh from training schools with limited combat experience. Their aircraft, Devastator torpedo bombers and Dauntless dive bombers, were adequate but not superior to Japanese designs. The Wildcat fighters were slower and less maneuverable than the legendary Zero. On paper, the Americans appeared outmatched in every category except one. They knew exactly where the enemy would be, while the Japanese still believed they possessed the element of surprise. As the sun climbed higher on June 4th, sailors on the American carriers went about their duties with grim determination. In the ready rooms, pilots attended final briefings. On the flight decks, ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. Down in the engine rooms, men sweated in 100-degree heat to keep the boilers running. Every man understood that the coming hours would determine whether the United States could halt Japanese expansion or whether the war would drag on for years with an increasingly uncertain outcome. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Japanese scout planes catapulted from their cruisers to search the ocean ahead of the fleet. These reconnaissance aircraft would prove critically important, yet Japanese commanders made a fatal error by launching them in patterns that left gaps in coverage, gaps through which the American carriers remained undetected. Meanwhile, aboard Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered the first wave launched against Midway Island. 108 aircraft, bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes roared off the 4 carrier decks and formed up in the pre-dawn darkness before turning southeast toward their target. At 5:30, American radar on Midway detected the incoming raid at a distance of 93 miles. Air raid sirens wailed across the island as every available aircraft scrambled into the sky. The obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters climbed desperately for altitude, knowing they were about to face the superior Zero. The Marine pilots understood this would be a suicide mission for many of them. Their job was simply to disrupt the attack, to shoot down as many bombers as possible before the inevitable happened. The battle over Midway commenced with savage intensity at 6:16. Japanese Zeros tore through the Marine fighters with brutal efficiency, shooting down more than half of them within minutes. The remaining American fighters limped back to base, their pilots bloodied but having delayed the bombers enough to matter. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every gun emplacement as Japanese bombers began their runs over the island's facilities. Bombs cratered runways, demolished fuel tanks, and shattered buildings. Yet the attack, while devastating, failed to destroy Midway as an operational base. The runways could be repaired. The aircraft shelters had protected some planes. The anti-aircraft guns remained operational. More importantly, the Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, radioed back to Nagumo at 7 o'clock with ominous news. There is need for a second attack wave. This message would trigger a cascade of decisions that doomed the Japanese fleet. Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. His aircraft carriers had been holding a second wave armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, prepared to attack any American ships that might appear. Now Tominaga was requesting another strike against Midway's land installations, which would require different ordnance, regular bombs instead of ship-killing weapons. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision: rearm the second wave for a ground attack. Aboard all 4 carriers, crews began the laborious process of striking the aircraft down into the hangars, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and replacing them with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. The hangar decks became crowded with dangerous ordnance stacked everywhere as mechanics worked frantically to complete the changeover. Then, at 7:28, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, the one that had launched 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems, finally radioed a sighting report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. The message electrified Nagumo's staff. American ships? Here? The intelligence reports had assured them the American carriers were far away. Nagumo immediately signaled back, ascertain ship types, and maintain contact. The response came at 8 o'clock. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo now faced catastrophe. His 4 carriers were in complete disarray. The first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The second wave was in the middle of being rearmed from anti-ship to anti-land weapons. Torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the hangar decks, and now an American carrier had been spotted. He gave another order: stop the rearming. Put the torpedoes back on the aircraft. The already chaotic hangar decks descended into barely controlled pandemonium. While Nagumo struggled with these decisions, the American carriers had launched their attack. At 7 o'clock, Spruance made the aggressive decision to launch his strike at the maximum range, even though it meant his aircraft would be operating at the edge of their fuel capacity. Enterprise and Hornet began launching everything they had: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. By 9 o'clock, over 150 American aircraft were airborne and heading toward the Japanese fleet. The American strike forces became separated almost immediately. Fighter escorts lost contact with bomber formations. Squadrons lost sight of each other in the clouds. The carefully coordinated attack dissolved into individual groups of aircraft, searching desperately across the ocean for the enemy carriers. Running low on fuel, many pilots wondered if they would find the Japanese at all, or if they would simply run out of gas and ditch in the ocean. The attack that would change history was teetering on the edge of complete failure. At 9:20 in the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, toward where he believed the Japanese fleet would be found. Waldron was flying a Douglas TBD Devastator, a torpedo bomber that was already obsolete when the war began. Slow, poorly armored, and vulnerable to fighter attack. Behind him flew 14 more Devastators, each carrying a single torpedo, and a crew of 3 men who knew they were flying into hell. Waldron had become separated from his fighter escort and dive bombers, but he refused to turn back. His instincts and calculations told him the Japanese carriers lay ahead, and he was determined to attack regardless of the odds. At 9:25, the Japanese fleet materialized through the clouds exactly where Waldron predicted. 4 carriers steamed in a box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was the most powerful naval formation in the Pacific, and Torpedo 8 was about to attack it alone without fighter cover. The Japanese spotted the American torpedo bombers immediately. Combat Air Patrol Zeros dove from altitude like hawks falling on sparrows. The Devastators, lumbering along at barely 100 knots, had no chance to evade. The Zeros attacked from every angle, their 20mm cannons ripping through the American aircraft with devastating effect. One Devastator exploded in midair, another nosed over and plunged into the ocean, leaving only an oil slick. A third caught fire and cartwheeled across the waves. Waldron's pilots pressed forward through the hurricane of fire, descending to wave-top height for their torpedo runs. The Japanese carriers began radical evasive maneuvers, turning sharply while their escorts threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with exploding shells. The devastators bore in through this maelstrom, their crews dying at their stations as bullets and shells tore through thin aluminum skin. According to documentation from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the sacrifice of Torpedo 8 was repeated with horrible similarity throughout the morning. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived at 9:40 and attacked through the same wall of fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of the 14 aircraft that pressed home their attacks, 10 were shot down without scoring a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown appeared at 10 o'clock and lost 10 of 12 aircraft, again without a successful torpedo strike. The torpedo attacks were a tactical disaster. 41 devastators launched that morning, 35 were shot down, and not one torpedo found its target. The Japanese defense seemed invincible. Nagumo's staff congratulated themselves on destroying the American torpedo bombers with contemptuous ease. The Zero pilots landed to refuel and rearm, boasting of their victories. On the carrier decks, the first wave from the Midway strike had finally been recovered and was being refueled for the counterattack against the American carriers. Victory seemed within grasp, but the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something vital, even in their deaths. They had drawn every Japanese fighter down to wave-top altitude, where the Zeros pursued the lumbering devastators with single-minded fury. The Japanese combat air patrol had become completely focused on the low-altitude threat, burning fuel and ammunition to annihilate the torpedo bombers. The skies at medium and high altitude had been left completely undefended, and at that precise moment, approaching from 20,000 feet where no Japanese lookout was watching, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were rolling into their attacks. The torpedo squadrons had died to buy this opportunity with their blood. Now, in the span of 5 minutes, the entire course of World War II in the Pacific was about to pivot on the actions of fewer than 100 men diving toward 4 aircraft carriers that represented the heart of Japanese naval power. The Americans' catastrophic losses had positioned them perfectly for the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet. McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons, had been searching with increasing desperation for the enemy carriers. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels. Within minutes, he would have to order his pilots to turn back toward Enterprise or risk ditching in the ocean. Then he noticed something in the water below, a white wake from a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at flank speed. McCluskey gambled everything on following that wake. The gamble paid off spectacularly. At the end of that white arrow in the sea lay all 4 Japanese carriers, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for the coming counterattack against the American fleet. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu steamed in close formation, while Hiryu lay several miles to the north. McCluskey's 37 dive bombers from Enterprise, joined by 17 more from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, had arrived at the mathematically perfect moment. The Japanese carriers were uniquely vulnerable. Their decks were jammed with aircraft ready to launch, bombers fully fueled, armed with torpedoes, their engines warming up. Fuel hoses snaked across the wooden flight decks. Stacks of bombs and torpedoes sat exposed, waiting to be loaded. The hangars below deck were equally crowded with armed aircraft and explosive ordnance. The carriers had been designed for offense, not defense. Their armor was minimal, their damage control systems inadequate. They were floating bombs waiting for a spark. McCluskey split his formation, directing half his bombers toward Kaga while he personally led the attack on Akagi, the flagship. The dive bombers rolled into their attacks from 20,000 feet, pushing over into 70-degree dives that accelerated them to 300 knots. The pilots peered through their bomb sights, watching the Japanese carriers grow larger with each passing second, while the anti-aircraft fire intensified around them. Black puffs of exploding shells filled the sky, and tracers arced upward in streams of light. But the Japanese were firing blind. All their fighters were still at sea level, out of position, and unable to intervene. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:24, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion touched off a chain reaction among the armed aircraft packed together below decks. Within seconds, the entire hangar became an inferno. More bombs crashed through Kaga's deck, 4 direct hits in less than 2 minutes. Each explosion triggered secondary detonations as fuel tanks ruptured and bombs cooked off. Fires spread with terrifying speed, consuming everything combustible. Almost simultaneously, 3 bombs hit Akagi. The first struck amidships, blasting through to the hangar deck where it detonated among the rearming aircraft. Torpedoes that had been carelessly stacked on the hangar deck during the earlier rearming confusion exploded with devastating force, blowing enormous holes in the carrier's sides. The second bomb hit near the midship elevator, jamming it in the lowered position and trapping smoke and flames below decks. The third bomb struck aft, starting fires that quickly spread forward and upward. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge and watched his flagship transform into a blazing wreck in less than 3 minutes. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Explosions rippled through the ship's hull as aviation fuel ignited and ammunition cooked off. Men screamed as they burned. Others leaped into the ocean to escape the inferno. The bridge filled with acrid smoke. Staff officers shouted contradictory orders, while damage control parties frantically tried to contain fires that were already beyond control. Soryu suffered an equally terrible fate. 3 bombs struck her in rapid succession, each one triggering catastrophic secondary explosions. The carrier's entire midsection became a roaring furnace. Survivors later described the horror of being trapped below decks as fires consumed the oxygen, and temperatures soared beyond human endurance. Men cooked alive in sealed compartments. Others were blown overboard by explosions or thrown into the sea when the deck plates buckled and collapsed. By 10:27, exactly 5 minutes after McCluskey's first bombers began their dives, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. The American dive bomber pilots pulled out of their attacks at low altitude and raced away at full throttle, pursued half-heartedly by Zeros that were too late and too low on fuel to be effective. Behind them, the Japanese fleet descended into chaos as destroyers rushed to assist the stricken carriers and sailors fought desperately to save ships that were already doomed. In those 5 minutes, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan's offensive capability had been cut off as cleanly as if someone had severed a limb. The empire's expansion had reached its high water mark. Everything that followed, the long retreat across the Pacific, the island-hopping campaigns, the eventual defeat, all of it became inevitable in those 5 minutes above the burning carriers. While 3 Japanese carriers transformed into floating pyres, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained untouched and operational. Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, watched the smoke columns rising from his sister ships and immediately understood that Japan's carefully planned ambush had become a disaster. Unlike many of his colleagues who might have withdrawn to reassess, Yamaguchi was a fighter. He ordered an immediate counterattack, knowing this might be Japan's last chance to salvage something from the catastrophe unfolding around him. At 10:40 on June 4, 1942, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck and turned toward the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this hastily assembled strike force, flying directly toward where the American carriers had been detected. The Japanese pilots were experienced veterans, but they were also shocked by the morning's sudden reversal of fortune. Many had friends on the burning carriers behind them. Now they carried the burden of Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific on their wings. The American carrier Yorktown became Hiryu's target. Admiral Fletcher had maintained combat air patrol over his task force, and radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike at a distance of 46 miles. Wildcat fighters scrambled to intercept while Yorktown's crew prepared for the assault. Gun crews manned their stations. Damage control parties stood ready with hoses and firefighting equipment. Every unnecessary item was thrown overboard or secured. The carrier turned into the wind and worked up to maximum speed. The Japanese strike arrived at noon, boring through the American fighter screen despite heavy losses. Kobayashi's pilots were among the finest in the Imperial Navy, and they demonstrated their skill by pressing home their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, starting fires in the rag storage areas. The second bomb crashed through the flight deck and detonated in the funnel uptakes, snuffing out 5 of the carrier's boilers and reducing her speed drastically. The third bomb blew a hole completely through the flight deck. Yorktown staggered under the impacts, fires burning in multiple locations, her speed dropping to just 6 knots. Thick black smoke poured from the wounds in her deck. For a moment, it seemed the American carrier might suffer the same fate as her Japanese counterparts. But Yorktown's damage control teams proved extraordinarily capable. They contained the fires within an hour, patched the flight deck holes with steel plates, relit 3 boilers, and got the carrier moving again at 19 knots. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Yorktown was recovering aircraft and appeared likely to survive. Then at 2:30, Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the dawn attack on Midway and reported the need for a second strike, led this desperate mission despite his aircraft having been damaged and leaking fuel. He knew he wouldn't return, but he flew anyway, determined to strike a blow for his dying fleet. The torpedo attack caught Yorktown still recovering from the earlier bombing. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down most of the attacking aircraft, but 4 Japanese torpedo bombers broke through the defense and launched their weapons at close range. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, the impacts lifting the 30,000-ton carrier bodily in the water. The explosions opened massive holes below the waterline, flooding multiple compartments. The carrier's power failed completely. She developed a severe list to port that threatened to capsize her. Admiral Fletcher reluctantly ordered the ship abandoned at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Destroyers moved alongside to take off the crew while Yorktown settled lower in the water, listing at a dangerous angle. More than 2,000 sailors evacuated the dying carrier, but she refused to sink. Damage control parties eventually returned aboard and fought to save her, managing to reduce the list and keep her afloat. Yorktown would survive another day before finally succumbing to torpedo strikes from a Japanese submarine. But for now, she drifted as a testament to both Japanese determination and American resilience. Yamaguchi's counterstrikes from Hiryu had damaged one American carrier and demonstrated that the Imperial Navy could still strike hard when given the opportunity. But these successes came at terrible cost. Most of the attacking aircraft failed to return, and their loss removed Hiryu's offensive capability. More critically, the counterattacks had revealed Hiryu's position to the Americans, who now knew exactly where the last operational Japanese carrier was located. At sea, Enterprise and Hornet prepared to launch another strike. In Tokyo, the Naval Command remained unaware that 3/4 of their carrier striking force had been destroyed, and on Hiryu's deck, sailors worked frantically to prepare the handful of remaining aircraft for another attack, not knowing that American dive bombers were already in the air and heading directly toward them. The day's butchery was far from over. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who had earlier led the attack on Akagi, now commanded this strike against the last Japanese carrier. His pilots had rearmed, refueled, and immediately relaunched for this second mission of the day, an exhausting feat that demonstrated both American industrial capacity to maintain aircraft and the determination of pilots who had already faced Japanese anti-aircraft fire once and were now returning for more. The dive bombers pushed over from 15,000 feet, screaming downward through scattered clouds while Hiryu's escorts threw up desperate anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese carrier attempted radical evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port while increasing speed. But the American pilots had learned their trade in the morning's attacks, and their aim proved devastatingly accurate. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, each one smashing through her flight deck and detonating in the hangar spaces below. The first bomb ignited stored aviation fuel, starting massive fires that spread forward and aft. The second bomb detonated near the forward elevator, jamming the massive platform in a half-raised position. The third bomb struck amidships, exploding among armed aircraft and triggering secondary detonations. The fourth bomb hit aft, starting fires in the engine spaces that threatened to spread to the fuel bunkers. But the American carriers remained operational and could attack again at dawn. Japanese aircraft losses had been catastrophic, not just the carriers themselves, but hundreds of highly trained pilots and aircrew who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience. The Midway operation had been predicated on catching the Americans by surprise and destroying their carriers. Instead, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced personnel while inflicting only moderate damage on one American carrier. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that sealed Japan's fate in the Pacific. The Midway operation is cancelled. The fleet will withdraw. The battleships turned west, away from the battlefield. The transport ships carrying invasion troops reversed course. The submarines pulled back. Japan's march of conquest had ended. The Imperial Navy would never again possess the strength to threaten American positions with impunity. 4 smoldering wrecks drifted on the Pacific swells, marking the graves of thousands of sailors and the death of Japanese strategic offensive capability. The war would continue for 3 more terrible years, but the outcome had been decided in those 5 minutes on June 4th, when American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with armed aircraft and fuel hoses. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his office at Pearl Harbor on June 7, 1942, reviewing damage reports and intelligence assessments from the Battle of Midway. The victory was clear, but its magnitude had not yet fully registered with the American public or even with many military commanders. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed. 1 American carrier damaged but savable, later sunk by submarine. The mathematics of naval aviation had shifted decisively in America's favor for the first time since Pearl Harbor. The implications rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Japan had started the war with 10 aircraft carriers. Now they had 6, and none could match the striking power of the lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. More critically, Japan had lost over 300 experienced pilots and aircrew, men who had trained for years and possessed combat experience from China and the first 6 months of the Pacific War. These veterans could never be adequately replaced as Japan's pilot training programs were already stretched thin. American industrial capacity, by contrast, was accelerating. The Essex-class carriers, massive ships larger and more capable than anything Japan could build, were already under construction. The first would enter service in 1943, followed by dozens more. American pilot training programs were expanding exponentially, churning out thousands of new aviators. Aircraft factories were converting to war production, preparing to manufacture fighters and bombers at rates Japan could never match. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff initially attempted to conceal the disaster's full extent. Official communiques spoke of a tactical setback at Midway and claimed damage to American carriers. The Japanese public remained ignorant of the catastrophe for months, but Japan's military planners understood the truth. The war had fundamentally changed. The 6 months of running wild that Yamamoto had predicted were over. The initiative had passed to the Americans. The strategic situation transformed with startling speed. Before Midway, Japanese planners contemplated further offensives, attacking Hawaii, cutting the supply lines between America and Australia, perhaps even striking the Panama Canal. After Midway, all discussion shifted to defense. How could they hold their far-flung conquests? Where would the Americans strike next? How could they rebuild their carrier fleet before the Americans attacked in overwhelming strength? The answer, as Japanese planners discovered with growing dread, was that they couldn't. The combined fleet shifted to a defensive posture, pulling back carriers to protect the inner defensive perimeter while trying desperately to build new ships and train new pilots. But time had become Japan's enemy. Every month that passed saw American strength grow, while Japanese resources, oil, rubber, aluminum, trained manpower, dwindled. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the long counter-offensive across the Pacific. The Japanese fought with ferocious determination, but they were now reacting to American moves rather than executing their own strategic vision. The pattern would repeat across dozens of islands over the next 3 years. Americans would land, Japanese would defend and die, Americans would move to the next island. The defensive perimeter would shrink. According to historical assessments documented in numerous academic works, including those by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Midway fundamentally altered the strategic calculus in the Pacific theater by removing Japan's offensive capability at sea. The Imperial Navy could still fight defensive battles, and would do so with terrible cost to both sides, but it could never again mass enough striking power to challenge American fleet operations decisively. The battle's psychological impact proved equally significant. American morale, which had been sustained by little more than desperation and anger after Pearl Harbor, suddenly soared. The Japanese could be beaten. The war was winnable. Sailors and pilots who had survived Midway became heroes, their story told and retold as proof that American fighting men could defeat the supposedly invincible Japanese. Bonds drives used Midway as a rallying cry. Recruitment offices reported increased enlistments. For Japan, the psychological blow cut equally deep, though it remained hidden beneath layers of propaganda and censorship. The officers who survived Midway carried the knowledge that Japan's navy had been decisively defeated in fair combat. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, lay in ruins at the bottom of the Pacific, along with 4 burned-out carrier hulks. Naval officers began discussing the war's outcome privately, whispering in officers' clubs and aboard ships in port. Some spoke of negotiating peace while Japan still held strong defensive positions. Others advocated fighting to the bitter end, hoping that American casualty aversion might force a negotiated settlement. But none could articulate a realistic path to victory. Midway had closed that door permanently. The tactical lessons from the battle influenced naval doctrine for decades. The importance of intelligence became paramount. Nimitz's victory had rested on knowing where and when the Japanese would attack. Code-breaking programs received increased funding and personnel. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers, despite their striking power, led to improved damage control procedures and better defensive armament. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons prompted development of better torpedo bombers and tactics. The Japanese ships that survived steamed westward in defeat, carrying wounded men and traumatized survivors who had watched their carriers burn. These sailors would be dispersed throughout the fleet, forbidden from speaking of the disaster to prevent damage to morale. Many would die in subsequent battles across the Pacific, taking their memories of Midway to the ocean floor. The few who survived to war's end carried psychological scars as deep as any physical wounds. Yamamoto returned to Truk Lagoon, the primary Japanese naval base in the Caroline Islands, and immediately began planning defensive operations. He understood better than most that Japan's strategic position had become untenable. Without the carrier striking force, the combined fleet could not defend the vast territories Japan had conquered. The resources Japan needed, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, required secure sea lanes that Japan could no longer guarantee. The admiral who had warned that he could run wild for 6 to 12 months had been proven tragically prophetic. 6 months and 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the wild running ended at Midway. Yamamoto would continue fighting, developing increasingly desperate strategies to force a decisive battle that might equalize the deteriorating balance. But the balance only tilted further against Japan with each passing month. In April 1943, less than a year after Midway, American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's travel itinerary. Fighter aircraft ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville, shooting down the architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway. His death removed one of Japan's few remaining strategic thinkers, leaving the combined fleet in the hands of commanders who understood tactics, but not the broader strategic hopelessness of Japan's position. The battles that followed Midway, the grinding attrition around Guadalcanal, the island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific, the destruction of Japanese forces in New Guinea and Burma, all proceeded from the fundamental shift in naval power that occurred on June 4th. American carriers, growing more numerous and capable, roamed the Pacific with increasing impunity. Japanese carriers, never adequately replaced, suffered further losses at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf until none remained operational. By 1944, Japan's defensive perimeter had collapsed. American submarines strangled Japanese shipping, cutting off the home islands from their conquered territories, American bombers began striking Japanese cities. The Pacific Fleet, built around more than 24 carriers, dominated the ocean absolutely. Japan's vaunted combined fleet existed largely on paper, its surviving ships hiding in ports due to fuel shortages and lack of trained pilots. The final year of the war saw Japan subjected to devastation unprecedented in modern warfare. Firebombing of cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The invasion of Okinawa demonstrated the horrific cost of assaulting the home islands. Finally, in August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's unconditional surrender. The line from Midway to Hiroshima ran straight and terrible. Each defeat followed inexorably from the one before, starting with those 5 minutes when American bombs found Japanese carriers. The empire that had seemed invincible in the spring of 1942 lay in ruins 3 years later, its cities destroyed, its people starving, its military shattered. The severing of the strongest limb, the carrier striking force, had bled the empire to death over 3 long years. Historians continued debating Midway's details. Did Nagumo make the correct decisions given the information available? Could Japan have won with better luck or better tactics? Should Yamamoto have abandoned the operation when the element of surprise was lost? These questions generate endless scholarly discussion but ultimately miss the larger point. Midway was decisive not because of any single decision or moment of luck, but because it exposed the fundamental asymmetry between Japan and the United States. Japan had started a war it could not win against an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity, twice its population, and unlimited natural resources. Japanese leaders had gambled that a series of quick victories would force America to negotiate a settlement. When that gamble failed at Midway, no path to victory remained. The 4 carriers that burned on June 4th represented more than ships. They embodied Japan's entire strategic offensive capability. Their loss meant Japan could no longer project power across the Pacific, could no longer threaten American positions, could no longer prevent the inevitable counteroffensive. From that moment forward, every Japanese action became reactive, defensive, desperate. The sailors who died at Midway, Japanese and American alike, gave their lives at one of history's genuine turning points. The battle determined which nation would dominate the Pacific for the remainder of the 20th century. It ensured that democracy rather than militarism would shape the post-war order in Asia. It demonstrated that industrial capacity and intelligence could triumph over tactical brilliance and warrior spirit. Today, the waters off Midway are quiet. The carrier wrecks rest on the ocean floor, their metal hulls gradually dissolving back into the elements. Fish swim through compartments where men once worked and died. The coral atolls grow over the debris of war, but the battle's consequences echo through decades, shaping the world we inhabit. The Japanese Empire cracked wide open when Midway severed its strongest limb. And from that wound, slowly but inexorably, the empire bled until nothing remained but memory and lessons for future generations about the terrible costs of aggressive war and the decisive importance of those rare moments when history pivots on the actions of a few hundred men fighting thousands of miles from home over a tiny island that most of them had never heard of before, that fatal June morning in 1942.